We are sitting in the former sales room for the Ryan's Mart auction complex. We're up on the second floor, but originally this building didn't have a second floor. There was just a long, narrow building that was part of a complex of 4 buildings that made up Ryan's Mart. We know that Charleston played a very significant role during the transatlantic slave trade, and it was a major port of entry for enslaved Africans coming into what is now the United States. About 40% of all enslaved Africans coming into this country in the 18th century entered through the port of Charleston. But the transatlantic slave trade was abolished in 1808, although there was much smuggling. But what we focus on here is the domestic slave trade, since the majority of enslaved people who were sold here at Ryan's Mart were American born. They were the children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren of those enslaved Africans that had been brought here against their will generations before. In 1856, when we see the first advertised slave sale here, the 20-year-old woman named Lucinda, this building wasn't even here. And if you look at the walls around us, you'll notice that this was actually an alley. It was an alley that led into the larger auction complex, and there were 3 buildings there. The main building was a 4-story jail or barracoon, and that's where enslaved people were held before sale. There was also a 2-story structure that was used as a kitchen. There was also a smaller structure in the southwest corner of the lot that was described as a dead house or a morgue. And if the slave trader knew that there was an enslaved person in that jail that was sick, they would remove that person to this other structure so as not to infect the larger population. Thousands of enslaved people were sold here between 1856 and 1863. The largest slave sale that I know about that was advertised was 256 enslaved people. In today's dollars, a very enslaved man who is in the prime of his life, very strong and able-bodied, could be sold for, in today's, about $35,000. And of course, if you had a special trade or skill, you would be worth more. Enslaved people had to be prepared for sale, especially if they had traveled from a great distance. If an enslaved person, let's say they were coming from Richmond, Virginia, and coming here to Ryan's Mart to be sold, that could take weeks or months, traveling on a good day about 20 miles, 20 to 25 miles a day. So it could take a long time. And by the time they got here to Ryan's Mart, they definitely wouldn't be in any condition to be sold. They would be bruised, probably with the shackles and chains they'd been wearing, especially the men who were shackled the entire time, very thin, dirty. They were in no position to be sold on the auction block. A potential buyer wouldn't want to purchase them. So arriving in a place like this auction complex, Thomas Ryan and then later Z.B. Oaks would have a staff of black and white, enslaved and free people here working to get those people who were coming to be sold ready for the auction block. Enslaved people were fed very well before auction, trying to fatten them up. They would also be provided soap and water here at Ryan's Mart to wash themselves, and sometimes they would also be given palm oil or some other kind of oil and encouraged to rub that into their skin so that they could appear healthier and their muscles would look more defined and they would look bulked up. So all of that would happen, and of course the last thing that had to happen was people had to find out when that auction was going to happen. And so ads would have been placed in the local papers, and some of those larger slave auctions would be advertised throughout the Southeast. So if you were a slave trader in the South and someone said Ryan's Mart, you would know, they would know where you were talking about. Enslaved people, you would think that they wouldn't have any agency, they wouldn't have any power in a situation like this, or maybe as they stood on an auction block, no power. They knew they were going to be sold, but there were things that they did. For instance, if there was a enslaved man who was on the auction block and a potential buyer started bidding on him, a potential buyer who he knew of, maybe he would start speaking up and saying, you know, if you buy me, I will work for you. I will work very hard for you, sir. And maybe start bragging about how strong he was, or how skilled he was. And maybe even try to encourage that buyer to purchase his wife and child also. And so enslaved people did that. And it wasn't because they were happy with their lot in life, or happy about being enslaved or content. This man was trying to keep his family together, and he was going to do anything and say anything to achieve that. The last advertised slave sale here at Ryan's Mart occurred in November 1863. And it wasn't until about 1936 that Miriam Wilson purchased the building, and she knew, and many people knew, that this was a place where enslaved people were sold, and she wanted to open this building as a museum. So she established the Old Slave Mart Museum in 1937, and opened, I believe, in March of that year. So opened this building as the first African American museum in the country.